our calculations as necessary, and again, reach out to the school district CFOs to ensure that we are looking at the information correctly and that they are interpreting the information regarding the administrative cap. We hope to have an update for you on that at the June meeting. The Department of Education is continuing to work with WestEd, who is prepared to provide a presentation to the Commission on School Funding regarding their work to recommend strategies for developing implementation guidelines for school districts, as well as the development of the reports that are required in Senate Bill 543. While we have asked WestEd to allow us to postpone their presentation until we complete the standing up of the model and identification of the initial recommendations that are due to the governor and legislators in July, they have shared with us some of their initial findings so that we can continue to work on building out those documents and not lose any time in being able to share information with the school districts once the model is stood up. We are continuing to work with the Department of Taxation to revise the school district budget template, which would be used beginning in fiscal year 2022 when the pupil-centered funding plan is implemented. Our work related to this with the Department of Taxation has slowed down because they have been asked to prioritize tax revenue projections and tax collections. But we are in communication with them and continuing to share information between the two agencies so that the work on updating that budget template will continue, just not as quickly as we would have otherwise hoped or expected. I did want to share with you that during our presentation tomorrow, you will have an opportunity to review the budgets that the school districts have prepared using the information from the pupil-centered funding plan. The State Public Charter School Authority has asked for the opportunity to go through the same process with their charter schools, although there's no requirement in Senate Bill 543 that they do so. And so that information we are hoping would be available in June or July. And I believe that the State Public Charter School Authority would welcome the opportunity to share with you the information that they're collecting from their schools as they go through this similar process. Lastly, we did want to share with you that we are continuing to research alternative definitions or indicators for at-risk. Today, as the chair mentioned, we have scheduled a presentation from Infinite Campus, which would provide some alternative strategies for identifying at-risk and then tracking indicators for at-risk through Infinite Campus, which is a student management system that is currently in place and used by school districts across the state. Madam Chair, with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions from the Commission. Madam Chair, I believe you're on mute.
Oh, I am absolutely on mute. Thank you. So I don't see any other questions, but I do have one. You mentioned WestEd and that you're still able to capture information from them, which is great. But you, I think you also mentioned that you're hoping for their presentation for them to be able to present to us. And when would that be again?
For the record, Heidi Hartz, we currently have two tentative dates in mind, being June or July. That is dependent on the outcome of this week's meetings.
Great, great. That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't a big switch. Any questions from anybody else now that you had a minute to think? Hearing, seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the presentation on using risk indicators in Infinite Campus as a means to identify at-risk students. And this was a presentation that I believe it was January and February, that we had asked for an update or some alternative thoughts on at-risk indicators. So with that, I'm not quite sure who starts. Charlie, Eric, or Ryan from Infinite Campus. So when you're ready.
I am. This is Charlie Kratch with Infinite Campus.
Okay.
Very good. I have a presentation to share. I will be sharing a PowerPoint via screen share for everyone. I have about a half a dozen slides to go through. And then per the earlier instruction, we can open up to questions afterwards. If there are any questions while I'm doing the PowerPoint that can't wait, be sure to let me know verbally, because when I go into the screen share, I won't be able to see people waving their hands. All right. You should be seeing my screen at this point. The title slide. Eric, give me a nod if you're seeing that. Very good. All right, so once again, I'm Charlie Kratch, the founder and CEO of Infinite Campus. I have with me Eric Creighton, who's our Chief Product Officer. He'll be available for the discussion part of the presentation. Okay, to start off with, we have a very straightforward agenda. First thing I want to do is introduce Infinite Campus, who we are, some of the things that we're doing for the state of Nevada. The second thing is present our definition of at-risk, and following that, evaluate, given that definition, the current free-reduced model that's being used to identify at-risk students, and then introduce the proposed machine learning model that we have, and then, as said, we open up for discussion. Somebody is not on mute, and I'm getting feedback through my headset. All right, thank you. All right, first of all, the Infinite Campus was founded in 1993. As I said, I am the founder and CEO of the company. We are located here in Blaine, Minnesota. We currently have about 465 employees. We manage data for school districts across the United States. We currently manage about 7.8 million students attending 2,200 school districts. Fun fact about that, there are more school buildings in North America using Infinite Campus than there are McDonald's restaurants. So we have a very big footprint across the country. We also work with 6 state departments of ed, of course, including the Nevada Department of Ed, with whom we've been working for a little more than 5 years now. So we have a lot of experience in managing student data all across the country. At-risk determination, there is a lot of varying opinions on what at-risk is. For the purposes of the data models that we've used for today's presentation, what we've looked at are the end enrollment statuses. So every student has an enrollment when they come to school with a beginning status, and then when that enrollment ends at the end of the year, or when the student leaves the district or transfers to another program, there's an end status. So we've looked at about 2.6 million student years worth of data and classified all the different enrollment codes as good, neutral, or bad, and taking those bad enrollment codes and calling those at-risk students. So if a student is removed from the school or requires social service intervention, moves to an alternate educational setting, is a no-show or otherwise leaves the districts, dropout, suspensions, those kind of things, we determine all of those students to be at risk. From a data management standpoint, as was mentioned, Infinite Campus works at the district level with our student administration system, or what's commonly referred to as SIS. So every school district in Nevada has a copy of our SIS they use, both public and charter schools. They use the student information system to enroll students, build schedules, take attendance, track behavior, create report cards, you name it, the SIS is where that's done. One of the very unique things that we're able to do is take all of that data in the school districts across the state and synchronize that data into a single statewide database in real time. So what NDE has is a very accurate copy of what's going on in the local school districts, all in a central location, which provides a very efficient means to produce reports like free reduced student lists. So that's a pretty straightforward use of our product. There's a lot of other things we can do, but topic of today's conversation, the free reduced count is what we're going to focus on. So what we did was we took a look at the current at-risk model using free reduced students as the basis for identification. I'm going to explain the stack bar chart to you. There's a lot going on here. The first thing is 42% of all Nevada students are identified as at risk based on their free reduced status. So about 42% of the kids in the state are free reduced. That means in this model, 42% are classified as at risk. When we look at the data, the outcomes that we have in our system with those kind of bad codes that I was referring to, only about 18% of students are actually at risk given those outcomes. So that's based on their end enrollment status. If you look at the stack bar chart, we can break this down kind of statistically into 4 groups. And this is going to sound a lot like what you hear about with testing for COVID-19. So I'm going to take this kind of slow, but take a look at the screen. This is going to describe what each of these 4 groups are. The first group are true negatives. So this is 53% of the student population in Nevada. These are students who are correctly identified as not at risk. So they're not free or reduced, and therefore in that model, they're determined not to be at risk. And history shows that those true negatives, or I'm sorry, yeah, the true negatives, that is correct. 53% are correct. Then we get into the next group of students. This is the 42% who are identified as at risk, or in this case, free reduced. The first set, 29% of the total student population, are students who are incorrectly identified as at risk. So currently, of the roughly 500,000 students in the state, over 145,000 kids are identified at risk. But when you look at data, you follow them through, they're not. They actually have positive outcomes. Now, 13% of the students are true positives. That means they were correctly identified. They're free reduced and they have negative outcomes. Then the last group at the bottom of the chart, and this is probably the most important group when you look at the model, these are the false negatives. These are students incorrectly identified as not at risk. So these are students who are not free or reduced, but they have those negative outcomes, those bad outcomes. You could effectively say these are the kids we miss. They're falling through the system with the current free reduced model. That's over 25,000 students. So it's important to understand that 25,000 students in the current free reduced model are missed. All right, so what can we do about that? Well, that's where the massive amount of data that we track over time comes in. Taking the data that's collected from school districts, instead of just looking at free reduced, what we can do is look at the totality of data that's in the system, and not only a snapshot of that data, but we can see the data over time. We can see patterns and trends using artificial intelligence. So machine learning is a discipline within artificial intelligence. You hear a lot about that. You hear about big data, you know, the things that vendors are doing with all kinds of information in the world. We can do this with educational data. So we have over 100 inputs that we use in the sample model that we created. 14 different academic risk factors. These are things like grades, GPAs, and so on. 6 different attendance risk factors, 7 behavior risk factors, 24 home and enrollment and stability risk factors, and 24 other things that all play into the model. This all goes into the computer. Artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms crunch through it. And then based on that, we can determine not only which students are at risk, but to what degree they're at risk. And this is represented in our product as something we call a grad score. It's a scale of 50 to 150. It's a lot like your credit score. 50 means you're more at risk. 150 means you're more likely to have a positive outcome, like proceed to the next grade level or graduating. So the higher scores are the better. And we can also return not only that rating or grad score for each student, but we can also break it down by subscores, areas like attendance, behavior, curriculum, and stability. So given that, what we did was we went in, applied the machine learning algorithm to a 500,000 students in the state of Nevada to determine how would that perform versus the current free reduced model. This is the next comparison we see here between these two stacked bar charts. So the first one we already took a look at, that's your current free reduced model. And the second, the graph on the right, is our proposed machine learning model. Now what you'll see in kind of the two takeaways from this, the first thing is, in this model, we identified 42% of students, just like in the free reduced model. So effectively we said, for the same amount of funding, identifying the same amount of kids, how does our system do? And both models, there's actually 18% of the students at risk. The difference is we were able to find, of those 25,000 students left behind, those were the false negatives, we identified 20,000 of them in our model. So what you have, the improvement is going from 63,000 students in the free reduced model who were correctly identified to 83,000. Now, our model, because we identify 42% of the students, i.e. keeping the funding the same, we still have a lot of false positives. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because what that means is you're over-identifying. You're erring on the side of safety. You're bringing a lot of kids in, but the important thing is we've reduced those false negatives, the students who have fallen through the cracks. And when you look at 500,000 students in the state and really only missing about 5,000, that 1%, it's almost impossible to hit them. That's a pretty random population that can't be predicted through data. But the ability to get 17 of the 18% is a pretty fantastic hit rate on these. So that's comparing the two models. Now, there are things you can do with our machine learning. We can change the number of students identified. You can change that 42% to different percentage numbers. That will affect the number of students we identified. But for the sake of this comparison, we kept the number of students identified the same. And of course, in the evaluation, the number of students actually at risk are the same. 20,000 additional kids were correctly identified. That's it. All right. Questions, comments? It's a lot of numbers and data. Yes. I think AJ, I don't have the ability to control who's here, so.
Okay.
There you go.
And Sherry, you're on mute again, sorry.
Member Schuling, good work at reading lips.
Thank you, Charlie, for the presentation. That it is very impressive, and as a data fan and a data visualization fan, that's great information. The concern I have is that, a lot of the work that is being done, and a lot of the work, some of the reason we're looking at changing the funding formula is the concern of transparency. And while in my mind, we would need to be able to explain how this works in basically like 1 minute to the public, and they would have to understand it. And the old funding model, in my mind, is somewhat related to this, where a lot of people didn't like Nevada's old funding model that we're currently under still this year and next, because it was hard to explain to the average Joe. And it didn't really seem like you could, I think a lot of legislators were concerned because they couldn't tell why money went where it went. And so I'm seeing that trouble maybe rearing its head with this, and just wondering your thoughts on that.
It's something we run into obviously all the time, that free reduced is easily identifiable. A family fills out a form, they qualify, they're free reduced. The problem with that is it's a very inefficient model. And that when you look at, especially a machine learning model like we have, it can be very complicated. Now, we can track through and explain what factors have the most weight, you know, for a student being more at risk than another student, because for some students, it's things like poor grades. Others, it may be poor attendance. Others, it might be their family life. But because no one factor, it's not binary. No one factor is just, oh, you missed 3 days of school, therefore you're at risk. It's not that simple. It does become difficult to explain. I'll give you that. I would say, though, the trade-off is when I talked about the false negatives, it's the number of students who are being missed, who are falling behind, that these are actually at-risk kids that are not being targeted and their schools aren't receiving funding. One of the things that we've done in other states where we've used this grad score before is we produce a dashboard for the local districts that every administrator, teacher, and student can see exactly how their score was calculated. And it's meant as a tool to help improve that student's educational process. What are the things we need to focus on, and so on. That works well when you're looking at individual students. When you're looking at, you know, for example here, of the 42% of the students in the state, to try to explain, you know, for hundreds of thousands of students, why they were on the list and why they weren't. Granted, it is difficult to do that as simplistically as free reduced is. It's a trade-off, you know, and as a data company, you know, we can show how this is tracked. We can show you the advantage and disadvantage. We can compare it to the free reduced students versus our machine learning model. If we kind of leave it to you to decide, is the difficulty to explain how it was calculated worth the advantage of serving, in this case, those 20,000 students? There is no kind of easy answer, unfortunately.
Charlie, a couple questions on my part. So,
Yeah.
one of the aspects of this, if I am understanding correctly, that is potentially appealing is that you already exist in terms of the student information systems within Nevada. So this would not require an additional data collection from any district
Correct.
within Nevada. And since I believe you said charter schools are also using Infinite Campus as the system for attendance and accountability, et cetera, through the student information, the SIS, the student information system, then that would not require them to have an additional data collection. So at least from that standpoint, that is something that is in common with just a single variable of free and reduced lunch. So neither would require additional data collection. Yes?
Yes, this is Charlie Kretsch. Yes, you
Okay.
are absolutely correct in that. This is all data we've had in the system that's already collected. And that's another thing that's allowed us to do a very accurate comparison of these models, because we've been looking at all the data that we've collected over the last 5 years statewide, and even going back over a decade in Clark County as we've been working there, and nearly as long in Washoe. So no additional data collection. We can do all of this. And one of the things I would say, as far as the accuracy of the data, I'm a former technology director. I worked at a school district here in the Twin Cities. And I can say with a fair amount of confidence that you are underreporting your free reduced students. That in certain districts, there's a lot of families who don't report their kids as free reduced because they don't want that stigma. The district I was in, we suffered from that. And the parents don't understand that this affects funding beyond just their kids getting a free reduced lunch. And if, you know, I was a technology director, it affected all of our technology funding. And an advantage of the kind of model that we're talking about is it doesn't require that kind of self-reporting on behalf of the students or family. We're taking all of the massive data that the school districts are managing on a day-to-day basis and using that much larger picture.
Great. As a follow-up question, and then I'll see if anybody else has some. Can you, on this grad score, so version 1, stack chart on what I saw was my left, is just a single variable at risk with and where it reports some error. Okay. On the stack chart on the right, which were the variables? I thought your flow chart there showed some of the variables that are included in the grad score, but could you, because you mentioned attendance, you mentioned grades, is there a set number of variables that have been identified that you could share?
Yeah, there are, in this model, there's about 127 different factors or inputs that we use. An easy way to remember them, a lot of times we refer to them as the ABCs. So
Okay.
attendance, behavior, curriculum, which would be your grades and those kind of things. And also, one of the things that we know, and you guys can probably guess this as well, is that if a student moves a lot between schools and school districts, they're more at risk. We to it. And that's why when we give this dashboard to the schools and the students to actually look at each individual student or their school or district population, we literally break it down by those 4 components: attendance, behavior, curriculum, and demographics or stability. And they can see, because we're calculating this every single day, which is different than free reduced. Generally, your free reduced counts are a snapshot, like October 1st. That's it. That's what we're going after. Because we track all this data in real time, we track that, we do a recording of that grad score every single day. And so that provides an administrator, teacher, or student, or parent the ability to see that daily chart of how their grad score is changing. And they can click on any particular point on that chart and see what happened, what caused my score to go down. Oh yeah, I failed that test, that was bad. Or I'm chronically absent, or there was a
I know that they were really depending on this chronic absenteeism, whatever. And, you know, it just doesn't make any sense that Nevada could take the whole state's data, lump it all together, and then bring it back down to the school sites. And then they determine what's happening. I don't think so. That's the cart before the horse. I think you need to determine what's happening at the local school site and target the students who are not being supported, and then put additional funds towards that. You're going to see this.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess maybe just 2 statements first, then a couple questions. The first is, you know, one of my concerns around using free and reduced lunch is the federal privacy laws that prevent us from actually identifying the students to the principals to actually engage directly with the students that have need. This, I believe, would alleviate that because we would be using criteria that are not protected in order to identify, which would be one very good aspect. The second really...
Yeah, see, they use that FARPA, the federal privacy laws, and to target how they don't have to express the work that's happening at the particular school site. And so that's not true. You still have to identify the support given to your population of children who are generating your funds.
Different needs. So I think those are some strong benefits of the program. The one question I had, or I have 2 questions, I guess, or sorry, 3 quick ones. But one is, in the model you showed, you know, at the right side, you still had the 42% identified at risk, but it looked like only about 88,000 were truly at risk. My point would be, I think I understand you did that from a modeling perspective, but I don't know why we would recommend over-identification. But you know, if we have a better way of identifying at risk, we should identify those, and then that would, in essence, provide a greater amount of funding per student in order for us to meet their needs, rather than spreading this too thin. Was I interpreting that data correctly?
Absolutely. You're, actually, this is a great crowd. You guys kind of understand this. I'm really enjoying this. And I did, I wouldn't say dumb it down, but I did kind of streamline the presentation, not knowing what depth of information you wanted. But you are exactly right on all of those accounts. Again, going back, my former life as a district technology director, we were always concerned about free reduced being a protected status. And that's the reason why a lot of parents don't report it. This alleviates that entirely. Now, we actually, one of the elements that we use in our calculation is their program participation, like in free reduced, but that's not 100% of the determination. That's just a small amount that factors in. So you're exactly right on that point. Also, you are correct that we are over-identifying. The reason we use the 42% number is that's what's currently being identified in the free reduced model. So we wanted to compare apples to apples. Now, we could, and we have produced models where we identify fewer and fewer students. The advantage of that is you're reducing the number of false positives for the students who are not at risk and being identified at risk. That has the disadvantage, though, your false negatives will start to creep up a bit. And so it becomes a balance. The nice thing is the way we calculate this is effectively we can give you some knobs to turn. And you can sit and turn, how many kids do I want to identify? How many data elements do I want to use? And because of the data we have, we will then, in the history of data, we can tell you how accurate that's going to be, giving you as the policymakers the tools you need to make policy. How do we want to balance the amount of money, the number of students? And then to your final point, which I think is dead on, is what are we trying to do here? And I personally think that being able to direct funds more than just broadly to at-risk kids, but really start to drive and target interventions, attendance interventions, behavior interventions, and so on, using that money very effectively.
You see, attendance interventions and behavior interventions don't calculate the exact problem that's going on. The majority of the problems come from our children not meeting minimal levels of grade level student achievement. And so therefore, it's kind of difficult.
That around. This is the first step, that I would propose. And another component, which I think you mentioned, is because it's not binary, it's not simply which kids are at risk and which aren't. It's kind of a rating with that grad score. How at risk are they? And so what you can do with that is say, do we want to do more or less funding for students who are more or less at risk, or even different types of funding? All of those are options that we simply can put on your plate as data people.
Great. Charlie, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? I know that this is an item for presentation and discussion only, so we don't need to have a motion or anything, but I don't want to ignore any questions. Also, I suspect we're going to hear more about at-risk in future meetings, so, but I don't want
I just have one other kind of small question. So because of the way that this is calculated, are students in this model, would you envision students moving in and or out of an at-risk category, as their score either improves or not improves? I know that it can go down or something, but, I know that would be up to us. I'm just trying to understand how you believe, it might work.
Right. We calculate these scores on a daily basis. So it's up to you to determine how you want to use that data. If you wanted to use that data as a snapshot, like you do right now for free reduced, where once a year you make that determination for the entire year. If you wanted to do it multiple times per year, like every term you could do it. Again, that's up to you. The data, the advantage you have is you have very accurate, very granular data that's being tracked on a daily basis. And we can package that any way you'd like.
Okay.
Great.
My point there for everybody, just from a consideration perspective, I think most of CFOs would agree, is that it is very challenging to take away funding from an at-risk or a program that's working and expect that to continue. So I think that, as we look at SB 178, that's a perfect example of when you give that money to schools and then they improve and you take it away, they decrease. So I think that just from our experience and probably every other CFO, as we consider this, we should consider that aspect that, they need to be able to remain in at risk at least a certain period of time, maybe not indefinitely, but I don't think that we want to set specific criteria they fall in and out on a regular basis, because that'll be very harmful. Thank you.
All right. Point taken. Thank you, Member Gowdy. I believe Member Fueling, you had your hand up there.
Member Gowdy asked my question.
All right, nicely done. Teamwork. Okay, any other questions? Oh, Member Mathis. You might be
Sounds
on
like she's
mute.
muted.
Yeah, you might be on mute. You might be doing my trick there.
Better? Can you hear me now?
Much better.
Yes? It's good? Okay. I will move my lips and use my voice. No, I remember being a parent at CCSB when we converted to Infinite Campus, and so it's been a while now. So I just have a question about other states. I didn't realize that you were more locations than McDonald's. That's pretty impressive. And so how many other states who are operating with a sort of funding model like a contemporary one, like we're trying to create, rely on what you've just suggested?
Yes, this is Charlie Cratch again. No other states are using this, using our system to do their at-risk calculations. Now, Kentucky for about 4 years now has been producing these grad scores and supplying them to the local school districts, but they have not been using that for their at-risk funding formula.
But they do at-risk weight in Kentucky?
Yes. Yep, and this is information that the individual schools use for their daily operations. But they don't use it for their funding formula yet.
Okay. And then did I hear you say that one of the features is that you can sort of move the dials? And so is that how you would envision it working? Is it, because it seems at some point for just budget management, some fixed point in time is one of the things about sort of knowing how many dollars you're going to get. So so just help me understand what you meant by move the dials.
Yeah, help me too.
Sure. This data in the interfaces we use, the Department of Ed will have. And what they would be able to do is using these models, you could determine a set number of students you want to identify. You could determine, you could plug in the amount of money you want to spend and how could that be distributed. And really any other way you want to do it. It really, what you get is, if you think of it kind of in simple terms, a spreadsheet that you can play with and do all your what if analysis. The difference is instead of having simple binary free reduced or not, you're going to get a continuum of 500,000 students with all of their grad scores at maybe that snapshot date. And then how do you want, do you want to put a cutoff and just give these kids at this end, or, the funding? Do you want to look at how at risk they are and create a formula based on that? That's entirely up to you. The advantage that you have here is the investment that Nevada has made in Infinite Campus over the last 5+ years, and to your point, in Clark County for more than a decade. You're now leveraging that investment to make informed decisions using actual data. That's what we provide you.
And so just a clarification, do all of our districts operate with Infinite Campus, including our charters?
Yes, they do.
Everybody does. Okay, great.
Every single one of them.
I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah, it is. You are one of a handful of states that has that advantage. And what you can do to make informed decisions that other states can only dream of, you're in a very enviable position.
It's nice to be in that position once in a while, right?
Once in a rare while.
What you wish for.
Yeah.
I think to the earlier point, one of the nice things about free reduced is it's simple and it's transparent. And that it's easy, but it's also not accurate. And the analogy I use, which maybe I'll leave you with, is routing maps. That when you had an old paper map, it was kind of easy to see where you are and where you wanted to be and draw a big line on it. But it also wasn't efficient because occasionally you'd run into a closed road or a lot of traffic. Well, today we have GPS systems like Google Maps and so on. And if you're like me, I simply put in where I want to go and it starts telling me turn by turn where to go. I don't know how all that works, but I tell you what, it is darn accurate. And thank goodness for it. That's a lot of what you're looking at here. At some point, we can explain how all the sausage is being made, which will make most people's heads explode. At some point, you just got to trust it because it works. And it's a tough thing. I will grant you that.
Although I have to tell you, Charlie, this is the type of group that would actually enjoy looking at all 127 variables, one at a time. I guarantee it.
I'm not sure.
Well, and it's also
of them smiling right now because they will.
And I'm going to warn you, it's not only looking at those variables, but it's their patterns over time, trending information and how they interact with each other. And it's what we call a combinatorial explosion. It becomes very complicated. Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, I see another question. Maybe, okay, Member Fueling.
Sorry, just one more quick one. So you had said you looked at 2.6 million or billion, I forget, school years, basically student school years. I would take that as a national data, not necessarily Nevada specific data.
No. Yeah, this is Charlie Cratch again. No, that's actually all Nevada data.
Okay.
Because if you take the 500,000 students that we've been tracking for the last 5 years, that's 2.5 million. And then we also added into the prior to that. But the model we used for this calculation was Nevada specific. Now, that being said, when we do larger data modeling, data mining, and so on, we actually use our national data set. But we wanted to make sure that, especially in the evaluation of this calculation versus your free reduced, that we were comparing apples to apples. And so we narrowed it to just the Nevada data set, which is, by the way, one of the, when you look at that 2.6 million students years worth, it is one of the better data sets in the country because all of your districts use our product at the district level. If you didn't have that, you would have a very small subset of that data at the state, and you would have no way to do this kind of analysis.
Great, thank you so much. Seeing a question, Member Mather?
Yeah, not a question, just a comment. I find this all very, very provocative because part of what we have done is we've invested in 178, SB 178, which was about lowest performance. So it gives us a chance to bring forward some of the things that we know have worked. And to the point about explaining the complexity, I think we can, I'm not sure that moving the dials makes it less complex, but to sort of peg, here are the factors that collectively define our risk, and those that are carrying more of these burdensome packages of responsibility on their shoulders are at higher risk. So I really find this provocative, and I had no idea that this is one way in which Nevada has a lead the pack moment. Some actually grappling with, wow, what do you do when you're not 49th? It just feels like a new place. But it just seems like when we've got the asset of this granular data that is consistent over every single student, that to not find some useful way to make it strengthen the funding formula feels a little like a miss. So thank you.
Seeing no other hands or questions, thank you very much. All the folks from Infinite Campus, thank you very much. This is the second time I've seen a portion of this presentation, so it is very compelling and address some of the many conversations we've had as a commission about feeling as though a single variable, a single component might not be the right answer. So thank you very much to folks at Infinite Campus as well as Nevada Department of Education for bringing this forward. I'm assuming that we will hear more about at-risk variables and potential mechanisms to be able to leverage that data that we have for the funding formula. So thank you. With that, let's go ahead to move to item number 5. And that is the presentation of pupil-centered funding plan model during the fiscal year 2020. Financial information by applied analysis, and that would be Mr. Aguero, Jeremy Aguero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Jeremy Aguero. I was asked to give you a couple of updates today, specific to the model that we have been working on, as you're all well aware of. As you know, for the past several months, we've been working on a blueprint schematic element to the model itself. That blueprint schematic really has 3 principal purposes for it. Number 1 is to become a precursor to the actual model that will be used by the Department of Education to run a budget estimate and to prepare for the upcoming biennium. Number 2 is to provide a test environment where we can look at alternatives and change variables and make any changes that are necessary, or look at the data to determine whether it's operating appropriately or whether it isn't. And then number 3 is to provide a platform for comparison. right, to allow us to look at the differential between allocations under the Nevada plan and allocations under the pupil-centered funding. The blueprint, I'll just drag over the current version of it and share my screen. Jeremy, while you're pulling that up, for those of us tracking it, is that the data model? It is not. It's the blueprint. Two files were sent out. It is the one that's the blueprint. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the clarification.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I just want to make sure, is my screen coming across just fine?
Yes, it is. I can see pupil-centered funding model.
You got it. So this is the blueprint schematic. We went through this last time. Madam Chair, unless you advise otherwise, my intent here is not to go through this page by page, but rather talk about the changes that were implemented between the last time you met and this time, and then pivot over to the pupil-centered funding model beta version that was just referenced, and is going to be the focus of my comments today. Is that appropriate?
That sounds appropriate. Certainly, if anybody has a question along the way, feel free to, we can address those questions if you have it about anything not mentioned. Thank you, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So all of the updates, as you go through, are going to be included here in something called the update log. And I'll make this a little larger so it's easier to see. But all of the changes and any schedules that have been changed are all included here. I'm not going to go through this. There are many just minor changes, reference changes, things like that are included here. I do want to mention 3 primary changes that occurred between the last model that was provided and this model. Number 1 is the removal of capital funds. In the last model we had, we noted that some of the values were higher than we otherwise would have anticipated. This was the result of capital funds being included in some of those values. Those have been removed from the model. The second major change that has occurred is a revision to the enrollment baseline. I talked about this last time. All of the enrollment data has been revised to reflect the latest estimates provided by the Nevada Department of Education. And then finally, the third element that is included has been to add a toggle that member Mathers asked for last go around, that allows us to include or exclude the funds that are distributed to weighted student groups at the district level as opposed to state level. All of those have now been included in the model. In terms of reference points in here, I would draw your attention to the comp set tables. We've talked about these before. Again, I won't spend a whole lot of time here other than to indicate that all of these schedules have been updated to include not only the information relative, doesn't want to move it too much larger, to include not only the allocation of each school district under the Nevada plan, but now the, forgive me, Madam Chair, my computer just wants to automatically make something smaller or larger. Under the pupil-centered funding plan, this is without hold harmless, and then the differential between those two are shown here at the bottom. The T schedules provide the differential the C schedules provide the differential in absence of the plan. In absence of the hold harmless calculation. The D schedules then provide the same comparisons with the hold harmless calculation as set forth in SB 543. Madam Chair, there's a lot that goes into this. Again, I'm happy to go into whatever detail the commission would like in terms of any of the outcomes here. I won't spend a whole lot of time here other than to say, obviously the distribution of some of these funds is now very reflective of the differential that occurs between districts today under the Nevada plan. Just to illustrate that, I'm going to go to comp set schedule C, C3, which looks at the values and their distributions with, sorry about that, with plan, what you can see is there are some pretty significant differences between how schools are funded from a base perspective and how much money is being spent on a per student basis for each one of the individual weighted categories. They are significant. I realize there's been a great deal of discussion about the difference between school districts and charter schools, or rural schools and urban schools. Many of these become very clear as we look through these, including some of the just frankly large differences between districts in terms of the allocation of existing funds. Under the pupil-centered funding plan, you'll notice that the allocations become much more uniform. This is as we would expect to occur here. We also recognize that there are substantial shifts where a district, either a traditional school district or a charter school, will substantially funded substantially less in a single category, pardon me, or allocated funds, significant funds to a specific weighted category where the pupil-centered funding plan intentionally seeks to level those out between the individual districts. Again, I'm showing it here without the hold harmless. The B schedules include all the same analysis with the hold harmless. Holding that to the side for a moment, I will now show the beta model for the funding plan itself. This is essentially the next evolution of the blueprint. It is when all the elements of the blueprint are pulled together. And then once the blueprint is pulled together, the next step in that process is essentially to streamline the analysis so that it reflects only the elements that are necessary for the calculation and distribution of funds. The table of contents, this is just a bit larger, the table of contents provides an easy way to see the difference here. The model itself is much more streamlined than the literally hundreds of schedules that we had in the blueprint. It includes three key elements to it. One are the model inputs, the second are the model calculations, and the third are the model results. In addition to that, there are a number of cell references. Those that are shown in this yellow color are cell references that are model inputs. Then we have calculated assumptions, cross-references, and then monies available for allocations, monies allocated in a specific schedule, or funds that are available for subsequent allocation. Those are all color-coded as you go through the model to make it as simple as possible in terms of going through the analysis. The beta version of the model itself, the red tabs as noted here, are the model inputs. The first is simply the title. There's the model cross-check that makes sure that the model is in balance. If we change anything in the model, then the goal here is to keep it as simple as possible. To make it larger, to make it a little easier to see. If anything here, if we change anything in the model, this little green area will turn red and will tell us that the model is out of balance. Really just a simple cross-check. That's one thing that I do want to point out as we're going through this. I think that you'll find that the model itself is much simpler than the blueprint we've been talking about because we've extracted out all of the comparative analyses that were related not to the pupil-centered funding plan, but rather to the Nevada Plan for Education Funding. The next element here is a control panel. Let's make this larger as well. Again, not overly complicated, but these yellow cells, including enrollment, including what the base funding was in the prior year, what the weighted funding factors were, and what the aspirational weights are the elements that are necessary for the model to calculate. There are intentionally relatively few of them. It's not overly complicated. It is a pretty simple waterfall as it flows through. The goal being that base funding can be no lower than base funding in an individual year, and that weighted funding, in the previous year, or that weighted funding can be no less than weighted funding in the prior year based on the multipliers, so long as revenues continue to increase. The model itself is dynamic, so you'll see that when we're looking at enrollment, because we're using 2020 as our base year, if we change that to 2022 or any other year, that the model will update so that the user knows that they have to update data for 2021 and 2022 as opposed to some other year. We'll go ahead and put it back, and we make sure that nothing happens outside of it, or that doesn't affect anything else in the model. The next section, 1.3, are all of the enrollment figures. And this is going to look somewhat complicated. I will apologize for that in advance, but it's really not overly complicated. It's just a lot of numbers. Each school and each charter school are shown separately. Their total enrollment, their special education enrollment, their English language learner that is not also special education enrollment, their at-risk enrollment that is not English language learner or special education, and you get the idea going ultimately to the right, ultimately getting to distance learning on the far right-hand side. These have all been updated to reflect the most recent figures from the Nevada Department of Education, including we have essentially changed out, if you will, all of the charter schools to make sure that they reflect what was legislatively approved for 2020. Those are the only assumptions that drive the pupil-centered funding model. The next section of the model is the calculations section. This is the section which actually runs the math that ultimately distributes the funds for the pupil-centered funding plan. The first schedule, 2.1, is the State Education Fund. It's larger, and scroll up to the top. This essentially has all of the revenues. They've now been sorted in descending order. You'll notice that we've eliminated, that you saw in the blueprint, we have eliminated any of the comparisons to the Nevada plan. We have eliminated the distinction between local revenues and state revenues because under SP 543, there is no distinction between them. These are all of the identified revenues that have to go through K through 12 education. They are all shown here to make sure that they are clear. The elimination of any revenues that would have been double counted, in this case the room taxes are ultimately shown, and then we eliminate federal funding, state match dollars, non-K through 12 education dollars, and other education programs outside of the pupil-centered funding plan to ensure that sources match uses within the model itself. Nothing more here than each individual revenue, making sure that that is the money that is ultimately allocated under the pupil-centered funding model. Schedule 2.2 is the first of the allocations under the model, which is for state oversight, administration, and non-district programs. The accounts are identified. It's shown as level A. Each individual program and budget account is listed. It totals to $77.6 million, which is shown here. You again notice that these are very simple in comparison to what was provided under the blueprint, because frankly, some of the comparisons that are required under the Nevada plan are no longer required here. 2.3 is the next step in the process, which is the auxiliary services for transportation and food service. Again, you'll see that they are relatively simple. These are not allocated in accordance with the pupil-centered funding model. They're simply the amounts that are necessary to fund transportation and food service. They're not part of the allocation mathematics, only to take them out at the front end. The historical values that are provided by the Nevada Department of Education are simply shown here. Again, very simple in comparison to what we looked at for the blueprint. 2.4 is the base funding amount. The base funding amount, again, and I should have pointed this out, green are funds that are available pursuant to our table of contents, red is the amount that is allocated, and blue is the amount that is remaining for subsequent allocation. The statewide base per pupil amount that is necessary to make the model balance is $6,383 and change per student. This merely shows the allocations that are necessary or that would result in each individual school district for statewide based funding as a result of $6,383 being allocated to each school district and each charter school in the state of Nevada. Again, there's nothing more complicated. These are simply calculation schedules. They don't require any modification or change. They simply produce the results in calculation so any user can come in and make those changes. The next schedule are the equity adjustments. These equity adjustments are consistent with those provided by the Commission, as well as under SB 543. Again, green being the amount available to be distributed, red the amount actually distributed, and B the amount available for subsequent allocations. The equity adjustments include the small district equity adjustments that are consistent with the Augenblick formula that was conditionally or preliminarily approved by the Commission. It includes the small schools adjustment, consistent with the calculator that I'll show you in a moment. And then the wage adjustments. Wage adjustments has now been implemented. In addition to that, all of the charter schools now have all of the equity adjustments, including consideration of distance learning that is included as part of the overall mathematics and calculus. Each school is totaled on the far right of the schedule. Again, users don't have to make any changes. These simply flow all the way through. There are two calculators that were shown last time. I won't spend a whole lot of time here. We'll make this a little larger to make it easy to see, easier to see, I should say, that allows the tiers for the small school adjustments to be adjusted here overall. It also allows us to turn off or turn on schools that should or should not be included. For example, the juvenile detention center, it was indicated it should not be included, but if someone decides that it should be included, we simply turn it to yes, and the model will recalculate itself all the way through. I should mention a couple of things. This also helps us to identify where the tiers become necessary, where they're not necessary, or where they would result in positive values or not positive values. One other thing that I should mention on section 2.5 is one of the things that the department has indicated is that within the legislation, the sequence of the equity adjustments is not small districts, small schools, and wage costs. And the district has indicated that they would prefer under the legislation if the sequence was the same as how the calculations had to take place. This is an adjustment that will be required during the legislative session. Finally, within this section is the calculator for the CWY adjustment. This simply allows users to make whatever adjustments they feel are necessary and appropriate from now, or the department to make whatever adjustments. I've left this calculator in just so users can make the changes actually just a function of expediency. In reality, once those are settled, this calculator will no longer be necessary and can simply be removed from the model altogether. The next step in the process is the weighted funding. Make this larger so it's a little easier to see. Again, the total amount that is available for funding, and because the model is balanced, that model equals the total amount that is ultimately allocated for weighted student funding. It has to match those values that we previously indicated were allocated in 2020. The allocations for K through 12 education, for special education, English language learners, as well as at-risk students and gifted and talented student education are all included, and then the total allocations are summed to the right. Section 2.7 and 2.8 are not utilized at all because there is no incremental weighted funding. There's no more, because we're looking at 2020 and simulating that there is no additional funding that would roll in. If there would be, the model would not be balanced. And 2.8 is merely to allow us to allocate any excess funds in the event that both the weights and the base were fully funded. 2.7 and 2.8 are merely designed to ensure that the user of the model is prepared for any contingency and wouldn't just have to deal with it, wouldn't have to recreate that in the event that something happened later on. 2.9 is one of the elements that has been enhanced between the last time you look. This is essentially the hold harmless calculation, and 2.9 merely provides the calculation under the no hold harmless or no 2020 freeze and with the 2020 freeze calculations. They're just side-by-side sister calculations. Where this is actually analyzed is in the calculator that is provided on 2.9b. And this calculator simply says what is the current calculated distribution, what is the hold harmless. This is the current calculation as if there was no hold harmless. This is the current calculation with the hold harmless. If this is the case, would this district be covered by the hold harmless or not covered by the hold harmless? It also provides the calculation for the net proceeds of mines to determine whether that is higher or lower to ensure that those funds are the first ones allocated out to the district and that the district of origin receives 100% of the funds that are generated by the net proceeds of mines. In 2020, this was not the case for any district, and therefore these all show no. The calculations then go forward on the right-hand side to reallocate the funds in accordance with the hold harmless and reallocate them to each district in accordance with SB 543. You will notice that the charter schools are shown here at the bottom. That is because they cannot benefit in the event, charter schools cannot benefit in the event that the hold harmless is put into play, and they don't benefit, charter schools do not benefit from the hold harmless calculation under SB 543. That is to say that if under the pupil-centered funding model, that there would be, that charter schools would receive more funding if the hold harmless didn't exist. That funding has to be taken back, if you will, in the event that there is excess funds overall, which is exactly what the calculations do. Finally, the last section of the model that is shown in blue, assuming it wants to jump forward here for me. Here we go. The shown in blue are the results of the model. Again, these are relatively simple and straightforward overall. The first one is the summary allocation. And you'll notice that this is much simpler than the summary allocations that you saw previously. They simply show allocations by level, and then they show the total funding, the funding as a percentage of total, the per pupil funding, and then the effective weights for each individual category. There is a notes classification here. The Department of Education indicated that they thought it would be really good to have sort of a summary note within each section here. This is something we will continue to include, or we just will include in the next round. It's very simple, very straightforward, everything ties out. The next one is the funding by school district. Again, this is very similar to the ones that you saw under the blueprint. However, this no longer includes the comparison to the Nevada plan. It's simply the allocations by school district, both in total and then on a per pupil basis provided underneath the total. We've included both without the hold harmless and with the hold harmless calculations pursuant to the Department of Taxation's request that we look at it both ways and have the calculations prepared for the commission overall. The final schedule in the analysis is the detailed schedule that you saw previously. Really, this is just a summary of the exact same schedule that you saw before, but it breaks it down by base funding, equity adjustments, weighted student funding, and then auxiliary services for each district overall, so that you can see each category and we can ensure that the sum of the parts equals the whole. With that, Madam Chair, that is the blueprint in its current form, as well as the beta model of the pupil-centered funding plan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions from anybody? I'm surprised. Oh, there we go. Mark Mathers. Member Mathers, question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeremy, I had kind of noticed kind of interesting figures related to charter schools funding, and I don't remember what tab that was.
I will pull it up. Why don't I bring it back over here to the blueprint? I think we were looking at this tab, Mr. Maslin. If I'm not thinking of the right one, I think I was mentioning it here relative to the per pupil allocations. Is this the one you're talking about, or did you want to see the total value?
I think this will work, but I mean, this is, yeah, this will work. So if we look at row 29 and go all the way to the right, you can see a total figure of 6,230 for charters, right?
Yes, sir.
And this is and this is what we're reporting charter schools receive in the current Nevada plan. So in Washoe, our per pupil amount is, I think, second lowest in the state. It's 6,034 per student. And so I think we're a good kind of example of a floor that charter schools would receive. So they would get our 6,034 per pupil, but they also receive a share of our property taxes, our 2/3 share, which amounts to roughly $1,200, $1,300 per pupil. So in Washoe, again, you know, based on a very low per pupil number of 6,034, plus the 1,200 of our share of property taxes, a charter school in Washoe would receive, you know, $7,200, $7,300 per pupil. So I wonder, this looks very, very low. I would assume every other district kind of operates the same way. You know, Clark is close to us in terms of the per pupil, and they also we all have to give charters a share of our property taxes. So I guess it looks suspiciously low, too low, I'll just say, compared to what we do today. So I wonder, maybe this is a question for NDE, or maybe you, but I think more NDE, what happened to is the charter share of our 2/3 property taxes that are considered local revenues or outside the Nevada plan, is that doesn't appear to be accounted for. So I guess that's my question. Is that accounted for in these current numbers?
Madam Chair, is that one you want me to try to answer, or did you prefer to direct that to the department?
I'm going to direct that to the department. I'm just about to do that. So, Ms. Hart, sounds like a question that might be best answered by the Department of Education.
Heidi Hartz for the record. As Jeremy has indicated previously, all revenues have been accounted for. One component that still is under development for the charter schools specifically is the number of students who are currently enrolled in full-time distance education programs. You'll recall that those students receive funding at the statewide base per pupil amount, and we're still trying to capture the data in collaboration with the State Public Charter School Authority to determine what that amount would be. So yes, the amount of funding going to charter schools in this table is understated because it does not include the higher amount for distance education.
Okay, but I'm not referring to distance education. You know, a generic charter school in our county receives $7,300 per pupil, not $6,200. So I get that all revenues are accounted for. Our 2/3 of property taxes that are outside the Nevada plan is accounted for, but I'm wondering, I don't think the model is accounting for the transfer we have to make to charter schools out of our 2/3 property taxes. So I'm concerned it is overstating our level of net funding and understating charter schools funding because it doesn't include their share of property taxes that come to us that then we then have to transfer to them. And that's in the DSA workbook. I mean, I can give you examples of charter schools in Washoe, and they all get more than 6230. So I'm not asking are all revenues accounted for, but is that transfer accounted for?
Mr. Aguero, do you want to attempt to address that, or is this something that we should take a look at for future, or do you want to ask Member Mathers for further clarification so that we can address his concern?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you. No, I understand exactly what Member Mathers is asking about. It's not something that I can answer off the top of my head because certainly we are essentially modeling the data that has been provided by the Department of Education. I think consistent with what Heidi said, I think every attempt has been made to ensure that all revenue is accounted for appropriately, but just to perhaps double check to make sure that the local portion of revenues that would inure to the benefit of a charter school as opposed to the district is flowing through those source schedules correctly. Look, what I can commit to do is circle back. I think that's a James question as much as anyone. I can circle back with Mr. Kirkpatrick, double check that is how it's working appropriately on some of his schedules, and then report back to this commission.
Thank you. Thank you. Member Johnson, question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Paul Johnson for the record. Yeah, and Mark, and maybe to put this a different way, follow up on that. In the current formula, they get 2/3 property taxes, 2/3 a portion of the net proceeds of mines, and they being charter schools. They also get per pupil amount of the government services tax too, in addition to our base per pupil amount. I think what Mark is getting at is, are the charter schools still going to get the base per pupil amount that the school district gets? And in addition to that, are they going to get that portion of outside revenue in addition? If they do, then the amount of money that they receive is going to be significantly more than what's indicated on the worksheets. Is that accurate, Mark?
Well, this table shows what they get today, not what they should get, what they get today. So you're right, Paul. I mean, you're right along the lines of what I'm saying. They get 2/3 of various local revenues, and I just can't see how that's accounted for when I see a number that low. And again, for districts that get much more per pupil than us, then those charter schools in those counties would get an even higher amount than 7,200. So it just doesn't seem correct that local share that they receive has been accounted for.
Okay. Mr. Aguirre, you have the information that you need to go back, and Mr. Kilpatrick, do you have the information you need to go back?
James Kirkpatrick for the record. Yes, I've made notes, and I believe additional research is needed to answer this question.
Okay, thank you. I see Member Casey.
Yes, and I'm sorry, Member Casey, for the record. Real quick, if this that Mr. Aguero has up at 6230, that's a statewide average, correct? Jeremy?
That is correct. That is correct, sir. Yes.
Okay, so maybe I misunderstood Mark's question, but I believe that average is where it is. It may include those dollars simply because all the majority of the students are in Clark County, which those dollars are substantially less than they are in Washoe or Churchill or something, unless I'm misunderstanding something.
They're not.
Member Mathers,
Madam-
Member Mathers, go ahead, and I thought I heard someone else as well. So Member Mathers,
Yeah.
go ahead, and whoever else was talking, we'll get you out right after Mr. Mathers.
Well, I mean, I'm hearing Jeremy and James say they'll look at it, and that's all I'm asking. But I just wanted to clarify, Clark doesn't get substantially lower than Washoe in terms of per pupil funding. I don't know if Jason knows what that total per pupil number going to charters in Clark is. That includes the 2/3 share of local revenues, but I suspect it's very close to ours.
Okay. And I believe we have someone, I think it was Megan.
Yes,
from,
Madam.
Nevada. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Sure, Megan Peterson for the record. They are correct. This amount is somewhat lower than anticipated. There would be approximately $1,200 more in outside revenue that we would expect to see here. So the department will look into this. And as a reminder, we are continuing to validate this model as we're working through this.
Thank you. So a part of the process. There we go. All right. Anything else? Excellent presentation again, Mr. Guerrero. Thank you so much. It's actually very gratifying to see things start to come into focus, at least for me, to be able to see that. Do we have another question, Member Mathis?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry. I guess I would just ask you, when would it be appropriate to talk about this toggle question of what the appropriate initial weight and multipliers are?
I actually think we were going to, it's hard, so Heidi, I'm gonna leap back to you because I think you and I kind of had a conversation about that we might be able to, as a part of tomorrow's work, begin to see the impact of that and readdress it tomorrow as well as in June. So I'm gonna double check. This is hard. Yes?
For the record, Heidi Hartz, that is correct.
I love it when I pay attention to her. Okay, so yes, we actually thought we would end up, as we start to dive into the analysis, comparative analysis tomorrow, that we would start to see some of the question marks from that come up. All right, any other questions? Mr. Hobbs, Member Hobbs.
Trying to find the mute button. Oh, there we go. And I don't know if this is directed to Jeremy or not, but going through all of this, there's a great amount of information in here. Obviously, it's a lot to digest, particularly if there are still things in motion to correct some of the data. But help me understand the reason that we have scenarios both with and without the hold harmless. As I mean, if that's just for illustration purposes, or if there's something else at work there, because clearly the prescribed formula as it is in the bill includes hold harmless, and so I'm kind of wondering what the purpose of looking at it without hold harmless is at this point. Am I just missing something? Anyone?
Madam Chair, is that one you want me to turn it?
Mr. Guerrero, go ahead, and then if we need to, we'll bring in Nevada Department of Ed as well.
Yeah, Mr. Hobbs, the brief answer I can give you is that I think at the outset, the goal was just to be able to see it from multiple different angles. Allowing us to see it without the hold harmless provides some view into the potential impacts that, with a potential shift, I guess I should say, between categories and between districts. Again, the way it's presented here has largely been at the direction of the Nevada Department of Education, but that has been my understanding.
So Jeremy, it's really just for illustration to see what the effect of having the hold harmless is. There's not any other rationale behind it other than illustration.
That's correct, sir.
Thanks.
Madam Chair. Heidi Hartz for the record. I would just clarify that we do need both calculations because as we submit our budget request to the governor and on to the legislature, the staff at the governor's finance office and the fiscal analysis division of the Legislative Council Bureau will want to see what the calculations are, and then they'll want to see how the hold harmless impacts those calculations for each school district. So both pieces of information will be active components for the budgetary submission.
Thank you for that
Madam Chair,
clarification. Yes?
just one other follow-up question for Jeremy. It really isn't much of a technical question, but having a model like this developed, because at this point in time we assume that this is going to be the funding regimen going forward. It looks like you've done a great job of documenting things like the changes that have been made and the reasons that those have been made and how complete those are. And I assume too, as you go through all of the revenues, for example, and each of the different points in the calculation, that somewhere along the lines you have those cross-reference to the actual statute. Is that true? I mean, I'm thinking about this from a legacy standpoint as much as anything else. Somebody's going to have to maintain and update this model on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, it's a good question, Mr. Hobbs. The department has been pretty clear with me in terms of the expectation of having appropriate documentation. I can show you how we're handling it now. You'll recall this is that beta version we were talking about, and this is the calculation. These green tabs are all those calculation tabs. We create a custom view that shows the administrative references. This is going to take 30 seconds to populate in because these are all sort of resetting the model, if you will. So just bear with me for just a moment, if you would. Or at least
Madam Chair, the reason I even bring that question up is having been involved in a number of these models over the years, sometimes the handoff to those that would be maintaining it, like in the example of C-Tax, sometimes that isn't as smooth as it should be, and there seems to be a redundancy in effort required to maintain the models. And also there's a greater sense of precision that the model that is being developed here and worked through is the one that actually is put into place. And that's my reason for asking that. I'm sorry, Jeremy, go ahead, please.
No, that's okay, Guy. And I apologize for whatever reason it's taking a while. Maybe it's because I have multiple models open. But if we wait long enough, what'll happen here is there'll be a little, there it is. There'll be a little lavender tab that'll open up. At least there should have been if it didn't just shut itself down. There'll be a little lavender tab that should open up. And it caused it to crash on my end, probably because I had so many files open. I won't attempt to do it again here, but essentially a little lavender tab will open up next to each one. It will have the statutory reference, the steps that were taken the steps that are required to update the model, any modifications to the model, and all those things have actually been integrated in. In a perfect world, I would have been able to show it to you without causing it to crash. I think with having 4 versions of a model this large open all at one time, I've stressed my system. But the brief answer to your question is, yes, it's all there. Yes, we're trying to tie it all back to the statutory references, and hopefully that can make it very, very easy on whomever that next user ultimately is. Certainly try to solve this problem before we get to the next meeting.
So you've included the owner's manual along with this, basically.
It's actually built in. It's just sort of, it's hidden right now. And so I thought I could show it to you, but apparently it's not going to let me do it.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing that too.
Great question, Member Hobbs. I think we've all been a victim of lack of knowledge transfer as one asset comes in board and one moves out. So thank you, Mr. Aguero, for making sure that the documentation is in place as well as the functionality for the model. So that's excellent. I do not see any other questions. We do have a number. Oh, I see another question. Mr. Johnson, Member Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is going to be real quick, and I don't know how the rest of the commission feels about this, but I'm wondering if we might be able to either use, maybe just use Jeremy's models and information that he has through spreadsheets to see the comparisons of the impacts of the model and revenue and everything else versus our existing funding as required. Instead of having, I don't know if NDE is duplicating something, but it seems like we have a set of data that we've received from NDE and the information from the model and the worksheet that Jeremy has. And we either have to cross-reference both or check both. It seems to me to be easier just to use the information that's in the model because all of the information is there and see the comparative analysis through that. And I didn't know if anybody, if I felt was the only person that felt that way, that's fine. I appreciate the work that NDE is doing. They're doing a great job. And every time I see Jeremy present, I'm impressed more each time. But I was kind of wondering if anybody else felt the same way or whether we should do anything about that or just leave as is, the way it is.
Member Johnson, just for clarification, so you're actually talking about the work tomorrow when we do the comparative analysis? And then Ms. Hartz, I'm going to actually, Heidi, I'm going to kick it over to you to answer that question. But I want to clarify the question.
Yeah, basically that comparison, I mean, the whole portion, it fits here and it fits there tomorrow, but here we're doing a comparative analysis. And we're provided with a model that's going through all the machinations that we're going to need in order to get funding the way it is. It seems to me that this is probably a venue to take a look at everything all in one place instead of having two different pieces.
Okay. Ms. Hart, do you want to take that?
For the record, Heidi Hartz. The Department of Education has been utilizing data from the blueprint as we have been presenting information to the commission as well as to the CFOs as they have been working on their budgets for the discussion tomorrow. So our conversation today will be focused on recommendations and concerns specific to the model. Tomorrow for the agenda item for the comparative analysis for the NDE budgets for funding going directly to school districts, we've compared the pupil-centered funding plan versus the pupil-centered funding plan as presented by applied analysis.
Okay. Is that, Member Johnson, do you have a follow-up question or?
No, Madam Chair, not a follow-up. As we fine-tune this and get this to its finished product, there aren't going to be an NDE thing and a applied analysis thing. It's all going to be one formula. So it seems to me that we just put it all in one place. It's a little bit easier and just use the spreadsheets that were provided. And that way, NDE really doesn't have to grab anything from a spreadsheet. It seems to me it might streamline things a little bit, provide one source that we can all refer to instead of different pieces, but I'm fine either way. It doesn't matter to me. I can adapt however way NDE and everybody else wants to do things.
Ms. Hurst, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Heidi Hartz for the record. I would just clarify that for the purposes of our presentation tomorrow, when we're comparing the Nevada plan and we're looking at per pupil dollar amounts, we did our presentation prepared strictly on the Nevada plan, not the current methodology of funding used by the Department of Education as a whole. So when we look at per pupil expenditures, it is built on looking at both the Nevada plan plus the funding for special categories. So we'll make sure that by tomorrow morning we can reference the documents that applied analysis has provided so you can look in a single location.
Okay, thank you. Hearing no other questions. We do have one more agenda item, but I'd like to take maybe a 7-minute break. That way we can have a convenience break, stretch, grab a glass of water, and be back here by 3. I'm seeing some shakes of the head, so great. We will see you back here at 3 p.m. That's 7 minutes, plus or minus. And by the way, thank you, Mr. Aguero, thank you, Ms. Hart, and the other folks at Nevada Department of Ed. Great presentation to see that model.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Since we have the majority of the folks back, let's go ahead and proceed with agenda item number 6, discussion of preliminary recommendations for successful implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. And just as a reminder, that part of the task of this commission is to make recommendations regarding the funding formula as well as the implementation of that funding formula. So we were hoping to be able to do that on, or not hoping to, but we're required to do that on or before July 15th, 2020. So we have the May meeting, we have the June meeting, and our meeting in July is on July 13th. So we'll essentially have 3 opportunities to kind of visit this conversation to ensure that we have the recommendations in place in time. And with that, Heidi Hart from the Nevada Department of Ed, are you there? I think I see you.
Yes, we are.
There you are. Thank you. We're ready to go whenever you are.
Thank you very much. For the record, Heidi Hartz. This presentation is intended to remind the members of the commission as well as the public what the requirements are in Senate Bill 543 for the Commission on School Funding to submit recommendations, not only to the governor and the legislature in the short term, but in the longer term to the Department of Education as well as the Legislative Committee on Education. We wanted to revisit these requirements because as we've been working with various stakeholders, there seems to be a perception that the work of the commission comes to an end once the funding formula is stood up and placed into the governor's recommended budget and then the legislatively approved budget. So we want to take this opportunity to remind again, the commission and the members that the responsibilities to develop recommendations by the Commission on School Funding are ongoing. For example, the Department of Education will receive recommendations from the Commission on School Funding on at least a biennial basis as we review the methodology for the various cost adjustments that are included in the pupil-centered funding plan. Certainly the initial focus for the Commission on School Funding are the recommendations due to the governor and the legislature on or before July 15th of this year. And then, as I said, moving forward, the Commission on School Funding will continue to make recommendations to the Legislative Committee on Education, who will then decide if to forward those recommendations or a version of those recommendations onto the governor and the legislature. And those recommendations will occur on a biennial basis and include a reflection of the activities or the guidelines that are already in place. We did want to reference where specifically in Senate Bill 543 these reporting requirements exist. Again, to remind the commission of what the recommendation requirements are, and to make sure that we've taken into consideration all the areas that you are able to make recommendations. So section 11.1 sub B indicates that the Commission on School Funding to provide recommendations on how to improve the implementation of the plan or to correct any deficiencies that may be identified within the Department of Education or any school districts or public school in the state with the implementation. These recommendations are to be done within the limits of appropriated funding. Section 11.1 sub C indicates that each biennium, the commission will review the statewide base per pupil funding amount, as well as the adjusted base per pupil funding amount for each school district, and the multiplier for the weights for each identified category of pupils. The commission will also recommend revisions and identify how to achieve optimal levels of funding for public schools, which may include the creation or the elimination of one or more of the categories of pupils who are currently recommended to receive weighted funding. Recommendations in this area from the Commission on School Funding must be the Commission must also identify a way to fully fund those recommendations within 10 years, recognizing that many of these recommendations may fall outside of the current level of appropriation. Skip one. In section 11.1, subsection D, the Commission has the responsibility and the opportunity to review laws and regulations relating to education and to make recommendations to revise or improve the efficiency and effectiveness of public education. In the event that the Commission makes these types of recommendations, there's also then a responsibility to notify each school district of these recommended changes. We need D. Good. We did that. Thank you. In section 11.2, the process that the Commission of School Funding will forward recommendations to the Legislative Committee on Education is outlined. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, the Legislative Committee on Education will review the recommendations presented by the Commission on School Funding and then to determine what the next appropriate action would be. That could include transmitting the recommendations to the legislature or the governor, or transmitting a revised version of the recommendations from the Commission of School Funding to the governor or to the legislature. As I mentioned, this process would begin in calendar year 2022 once the pupil-centered funding plan has been stood up. In section 11.1 sub E, the Commission is responsible to recommend and review the cost adjustment factors for each county, to review the method that's used to determine the necessarily small school adjustment, as well as the method for calculating the small district equity adjustment. And then in section 76.3, the recommendations and the process for the comparative analysis are identified. In this section, the Commission is tasked with examining the results of the comparisons prepared by the school districts, where the school districts were required to project their budgets using the pupil-centered funding plan. And then based on the results of the budgets for the school districts using the current funding methodology versus the pupil-centered funding plan, the Commission has the opportunity to recommend changes, again, to ensure successful implementation of the plan moving forward. To facilitate the development of the Commission's recommendations, the Department of Education has been working with the chair to identify a process and a timeline to ensure that the Commission has more time to reflect on areas that may need further examination or that certainly need a recommendation to be developed, ensuring that the recommendations are ready to be submitted to the governor and the legislature by the July 15th deadline. This slide outlines that today and tomorrow there'll be an opportunity to review the model, as well as conduct or review the comparative analysis of the NDE budgets as well as the school district budgets, looking at both qualitative and quantitative information. And we also want to acknowledge that since the Commission began meeting in September, the Commission has identified various areas that they believe recommendations may be necessary moving forward. As we mentioned, the meetings in June and July would be dedicated towards developing and finalizing those recommendations. We did create this slide just to illustrate some of the recommendations or areas of concern that have been identified by Commission members since the Commission began meeting. That would include ensuring that the net proceeds of minerals is spent within the county for which the funds were earned. There have been concerns expressed regarding the definition of the ending fund balance. There have also been concerns regarding the hold harmless and the fact that there's no provision in place for charter schools. Some concern has been expressed regarding the weighted funding for special education administered at the school at the school level. There's also been concern identified around special education that using a single weight for all districts may impact the maintenance of effort and may challenge some school districts to meet the maintenance of effort or to sustain it moving forward. And then today we did have another reminder about the concerns regarding using the free and reduced lunch as the indicator for at-risk pupils. So what we would like to do at this point, Madam Chair, is to open it up for the commission to identify concerns or recommendations that they have based on the beta version of the model that was presented. Keeping in mind that tomorrow will be the opportunity to provide further discussion and recommendations regarding information gleaned from the budget comparisons for both the state and the local school districts. Next slide.
Okay.
Last slide, Megan. There you go.
There you go. Excellent.
Okay, and I think you did connect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Heidi Hart. Good conversations and things to think about. Do I have any comments, questions, concerns, things to add to the list for us to ponder in terms of recommendations? Again, this particular item, I'm going to confirm, is at this point information and discussion. So this is not about making a motion today, but information and discussion so that it can help guide us. Member Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Heidi. I really appreciate that presentation. It was succinct in what our responsibilities are. I'm not sure how to capture this, but I almost look at it as the elephant in the room. We know that as a state, we are up against some significant budget reductions. And education funding has a reduction that's already been applied in the current year. And as educators, we wait for the impact of reduction in the subsequent school year. The statute, SB 543, references our current year as the hold harmless year. Yet it's already going to be subject to change, and next year it's going to change even more. And so I see some significant impacts, and in some essence, I almost look at it as a double negative in terms of the pupil-centered funding plan and shifting some what we all recognize is inoptimal funding across districts, combined with overall budget reductions that are going to be required of all state agencies, including education. So the interplay of what we are facing as a nation, as a state, combined with the rollout of the pupil-centered concern. And I'd like to learn more about how we're going to look at that and how we're going to address that. And even if that's the role of the commission, and the individuals I've talked to said, look, our role as a commission is very defined on what we can and can't do. And there's some areas that we just simply can't address, or we can't try to rectify, as it's not within our scope. But this has me concerned. So that's one thing I wanted to share. I don't want to take up a lot of time. And I could talk about the administrative costs, but James, I appreciate James being open. I'm concerned with the way that we're capturing administrative costs, because it's including board of trustees, it's including secretaries. I don't believe that was the intent behind it. So I appreciate that that's being clarified as we work with our chief financial officers. So thank you.
All right, you may have captured my question because we referenced that earlier. Heidi Hart, just a quick question. Earlier today, I think it was you, I took a note that possible one area for recommendations may be the administrative cap and or the definition. So is that same topic? So has my question mark been covered already by Member Jensen?
So Heidi Hartz, for the record, yes, during the update on the activities of the Department of Education, we did indicate that we're continuing to work on that, just to make sure that we have clarification from APA based on the input we had from CFOs.
Perfect. That's what I thought I heard. I just like to check. Other conversation? Excellent. Member Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I wanted to go back to a point, I think it was Mark brought it up, about it deals with how fluid this funding is going to be to the school districts in a year for students that go in and out of different categories, and whether or not we want to go back and reconsider funding based on account day or funding based on a quarterly enrollment. Because as a school district, if as a practical matter, when students move between categories, we aren't going, as a school district, maybe going to have the luxury to change services during a year. So we're not going to adapt our expenditures necessarily based on how the funding fluctuates. So how fluid are we really going to want this funding and the student counts to be during the school year, when essentially all of our labor and most of our expenses are locked into a one-year annual contract?
Point taken. Other conversation on that one? Because that we bumped into that earlier too. Thank you, Member Mathers.
Sorry, I prematurely raised my hand. I had other points, so nothing
That's
to add.
okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead with your other points. That's fine.
Well, turnaround's fair play. I think Paul brought up a while back, and I thought it was a good point, that for those in a hold harmless situation, you'd still receive some kind of inflationary increase to your base funding. And I think that's definitely something we need to consider. In addition to that, and maybe it's just me having a tough time conceptualizing how you would do this, but there is a clause in SB 543 that prohibits using weighted funding for basically salary and benefit increases, is how I interpret it. And I think maybe, Madam Chair, you and I talked about that too, where if I'm reading it correctly, I don't know how, when in WASHA we have hundreds of employees funded from our special education fund, how we would be able to budget in accordance with SB 543. In other words, I'd have to budget salary increases and benefit increases in my base funding for special education staff and have their base salary that's somehow grandfathered in, funded out of special ed, if that makes any sense at all. I think I understand the intent of the clause in SB 543 that, this extra money for wage shouldn't be used just to increase teacher salaries, I think was maybe the notion. But I just don't know from a budgeting perspective how I avoid budgeting salary and benefit increases for special education staff in the general fund versus the special education fund where they're at. I didn't say that very well, but that gets to the complexity, I think, of what we'd have to do, if we were really to abide by this clause. So I think that needs to be looked at. If that Paul or Dave or AJ or Jason, if you get my point. Okay, thanks.
And we'll jump to Member Johnson, but if it makes you feel better, you are not the only person that I've had that conversation with. So there's multiple in the group that have expressed that concern. So if all of those services are tied to additional staff, then how do you separate the two? So Member Johnson.
Madam Chair, I think you summarized it pretty good. If you have a percentage of the revenue that goes for funding and it doesn't increase with wages, and we as school districts have to increase all categories of wages by an amount of money, then there's some conflict between, we have to make sure that the weights can keep pace with that. And if they don't, we're going to be subsidizing more of those weights with our operating funds.
Okay, good. Member Fueling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It came up a number of months back when Mr. Aguero was going through in discussing the net proceeds of minerals, and I appreciated that in his model. He broke that out separately. Carson City doesn't benefit from that, but I know there's a lot of districts concerned about that. In the way, there has to be some additional language written that, and I don't know exactly what it is, but the way SB 543 currently tracks, the net proceeds dollars stay effectively, no matter what, stay with the county. They'll come back to the county school district. But then those funds, if they go into the fund balance of the district, in that with the ending fund balance provision of the 16.6 and everything gets swept, there has to be some kind of mechanism for them, I think, to keep those funds in county. So it's just another piece.
Understood. Okay. All excellent. And I seem to recall, like you just mentioned, Member Schuling, that sometimes we bumped up into these conversations along the way, so it's good to recapture some of them. Member Gowdy, any other thoughts? Member Hobbs? Member Casey, anything? No? Member Mather? No? Okay. The only point I was going to, on the fluidity of this categories as they shift and things, I know that, and AJ and Jim, keep me honest, I do know that WestEd at one point was doing a presentation about reporting dates and structuring dates around not only when reports should come in, but data should be gathered and maybe possible shifts along the way, which would be that fluidity if there is any. So I think as we start to explore making the recommendations of as of date, and I also do recall from years ago when we only had one attendance reporting. So your funding for students was based on a single day in September, and then whatever happened to you over the year is what happened, which also wasn't great. So finding that balance, which is a little closer to what exists now, but not just thinking about the dollars flowing, but also everything else that has to connect to the dollars flowing. Districts reporting, data being crunched, and then the money flowing and shifting as we think about that. So that was my only additional comment to that. I see another hand. Member Jensen.
Thank you. One thing I forgot to mention, this is for Jeremy and Heidi and James. I believe as I went through the documents, I noticed that on the cost adjustment factor, implementing the NCEI, Elko County was reflected at 1.0 and Douglas at 1.03. I believe that those two were swapped. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it should be Elko at 1.03 and Douglas at 1, and those numbers are reversed.
Madam Chair, this is Jeremy. I'll double check that and make sure that it's accurate.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other questions, hearing no other questions. Again, I echo earlier sentiments. Heidi Hart, Nevada Department of Ed, James Kilpatrick, Bo, and Megan, thank you very much for reminding us about our tasks and the recommendations and our timelines. I believe we are ready to move on to public comment number 2. Jessica, do we have any additional public comment for non-agenda items?
Madam Chair, we have not received any additional public comment at this time.
All righty. Okay. In that case, I am looking forward to our meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I think it's the same virtual location. And do we have any comments or statements or final thoughts from any of the members of the commission? Otherwise, I am looking forward tomorrow to spending some time on the comparative analysis and taking a look and walking through the process of comparing the Nevada, looking at the Nevada plan and looking at the pupil-centered plan. And looking forward to diving in a little deeper to some of these recommendations and maybe a little more complex.
I guess they want off. Stop the share. And end the recording.